If the police had seen that smelly, semi-naked man in my car, I would have spent the night in the cell, but I'll get to that. It had been a tough week of nights at work, and now finally the weekend was here. The three of us had waited outside the off license for it to open at 11 a.m. and bought our chosen poison. I took a bottle of Bacardi, 6 tins of Strongbow, and 6 tins of Guinness to make snake bites. Phil preferred a bottle of gin and was hoping to scrounge some of my snake bites, and Kerry was very sophisticated with a bottle of Black Tower. It was going to be a classy night. Phil and I had formed a very tight friendship since meeting the year before. We had allowed Kerry in as an honorary member, and not only because she was the only one with her own house. Kerry had invited us to her house to stay over for the weekend, and although we hadn't slept since yesterday, we were not going to let that get in the way of a day's drinking. We bought some food, threw our bags in Kerry's spare room, and had an early lunch, with drinks, of course. Today, it would be called brunch, but that was 1985 and brunch hadn't been invented yet. I Want to Know What Love Is by Foreigner was at the top of the charts. The miners' strike was in full flow. EastEnders' first episode had just aired and leg warmers were all the rage. We drank, slept where we sat, and drank more until late in the evening, when I looked out of the window and saw Stevie arriving in his car. I remarked that Stevie had arrived and wondered if he lived on this street as well. Kerry got into a tizzy, as she must have been expecting him, but hadn't told us. And because mobile phones had only been invented 5 minutes ago, he hadn't been able to give her any warning that he would be arriving. Stevie worked in our company on a different shift, and there was no issue in him paying Kerry a visit, except he was engaged to marry Deirdre, and I don't think she knew he was visiting us. Well, Kerry. Kerry, lovely as always, asked us to give her the house for the evening. We couldn't really argue, as it was her house, and Stevie was now sitting on the sofa beside her, although more turned towards each other and leaning in, gazing into each other's eyes, engaging in small talk and laughing at the same not funny jokes. So Phil and I made our exit, with nowhere to go and maybe not even a bed for the night. I had the key to my pristine Ford Sierra XR4i, which was a very fine car in its day, and we agreed that we needed some more drink, as you would in the circumstances. So we headed into Belfast city centre and parked up near a couple of pubs that we liked. Drinking and driving is a very serious offence and should never be done, but it was less frowned upon then. I was drunk, in my early 20s, and lacking the sense I was born with. As the evening progressed, we visited more pubs until closing time at 11:30 p.m. Although we hadn't slept in 30 hours, I needed to see Mary. Mary Davidson was a nurse I had met at work, and we had dated on a couple of occasions, but it was nothing serious for her, as she already had a boyfriend back at home in County Monaghan. I was more interested than she was. Mary shared a house with 2 other nurses in the student area of Belfast, near the hospital, and in my wisdom, I thought that telling Mary tonight that I was in love with her was one of my better plans, and it would free her from the uncertainty of leaving her boyfriend from back home and taking up with me. Phil and I got into the car and travelled to the residential street that Mary lived on. It was a very narrow street of red brick pre-war terraced houses, with cars parked on both sides of the street, making only a single lane possible down the middle. I stopped outside Mary's house and abandoned the car, with Phil sleeping on the passenger seat. I went to her door and knocked quietly, so as not to waken anyone on the street. No response. I knocked harder, and still no response. Then I shouted in a loud whisper, "Mary! Mary!" An upstairs window opened 2 doors away, and Rosemary, one of her housemates, put her head out and told me that Mary was asleep. Instead of walking along the pavement to the correct house, I clambered over the small garden walls to below below Rosemary, and tried to negotiate with her to waken Mary, as I had something very important to tell her. Rosemary explained that they were on an early shift the next morning and she needed me to go away. I begged, but there was no shifting her. I walked out onto the footpath and began shouting, "Mary! Mary, come to the front door. I need to talk to you. I have something important to tell you." When nothing happened, I shouted, "Mary, I love you. I swear. Leave him and be with me. I love you." Rosemary opened the window again and told me to go home. I ignored her this time and continued shouting for Mary, but she never made an appearance, and Rosemary broke the news that Mary didn't want to see me again, ever. I didn't believe her, but since some of the lights in the other houses on the street came on and windows were being opened, I decided that maybe it would be best left until tomorrow to explain to Mary how much I loved her. I got back into the car and carefully drove through the maze of streets trying to find my way back to Kerry's house. We drove past a police station and I stopped at the red traffic lights at the end of the road. There was very little traffic. I turned and looked at Phil. "You okay, mate?" I asked. He didn't respond or move. He just opened his mouth and threw up the full contents of his stomach into the V shape created into the V shape created by his crotch on the seat of my pride and joy. He still didn't move. I got out of the driver's seat and opened his door, took his seatbelt off and prized him out of his seat. The V of vomit now spread to the rest of the seat. And I scooped it off with my one hand. I'm sorry. Because my other hand was holding him up. He became aware of his surroundings at that moment and realized that he had a crotch of vomit. He dropped his jeans in an effort to get as far away from them as possible. I set him on the curb, removing his shoes and jeans, leaving him to travel home in his pants. I loved that car, and I knew it would never be the same again. But I loved Phil more, so taking care of him, using my bare hands to clean his minor indiscretion, did not faze me. And I placed him back on the sodden seat before any police cars returning to the police station passed us. When we got back to Kerry's, the house was in darkness. Stevie's car was still on the street. I used the key she had given me and helped Phil up to the bedroom. I was afraid to put on the light in case I woke Stevie, but then I realized he must have been staying in the other room. I was never one for making or keeping friends, but Phil and I had something very special, which I cherished for the many years we were close. Life and circumstances got in the way, and we no longer have any contact, which saddens me greatly, all the more so because there was no fallout, no crossword or end date. I never saw Mary again. Stevie married Deirdre. My car never smelled the same. Kerry died.